Hello, and welcome to the Logistics Management Podcast Series. My name is Jeff Berman. I'm Group News Editor for Logistics Management Magazine, as well as the Peerless Media Supply Chain Group. Today is a real pleasure to welcome Tony Hatch back to our podcast. Tony is a longtime friend of Logistics Management Magazine and serves as principal of ABH Consulting based in New York City. Tony has nearly 3 decades of experience in the freight, railroad, and transportation sectors, primarily as an analyst. In his role at ABH Consulting, Tony has been focused on the freight transportation segment, particularly surface transportation, and is well known for his knowledge of the intermodal sector, where the various modes of freight transport converge, on which he has held several dozen specialized conferences. Prior to launching ABH Consulting, Tony was an analyst for Salomon Brothers, then at Argus, Payne Weber, and NatWest Markets USA, prior to starting his own independent analyst and consultancy in 1999. Tony also programs the annual, and I may add excellent, Rail Trends Conference, which is held every November in New York City, featuring C-level speakers from the Class 1 railroads and short lines and various industry experts, analysts, and association leaders. Tony graduated from Harvard and is probably the biggest Los Angeles Dodgers fan you're ever going to meet in your life. So, Tony, welcome back.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to talk to you as always. And while the baseball and the Dodgers are my first and deepest love, you and I share the same hockey team. So we're both let's go Rangers.
That's right. That's right. It's an exciting time of the year.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So Tony, just to jump in here, I know we've done this a few times having you on the podcast, and I always like to start with current market conditions. And when we look at things like volume numbers, when we look at service, and we're talking about rail carload, we're talking about intermodal in terms of the volumes that is. So take your pick, start what you like, and we can just go from there.
Well, in the fourth quarter earnings, in my slide deck at the various meetings I've attended the last couple of weeks, which have all been really interesting, the big short line conference and a Southeast Association of Rail Shippers, and a few others, right? I have a slide in there that says, that basically the fourth quarter earnings and the webcast provided no real proof of life. Like, we expect the railroads to be growth pivoting, paraphrasing Keith Creel. They've talked about that for a while. We were hoping for a good year. And I think the key word that came out of the fourth quarter earnings, the calls were in January, was when Union Pacific said their outlook was muted. And everybody picked up on the word muted. You'll hear it just as growth pivot became picked up. Muted is the key thing. And I think, frankly, the first quarter numbers, which will be coming out in a couple of weeks, are going to be the same. They may be offering a little bit of proof of life, a little bit, but nothing really ecstatic. No jumping jacks here. The volumes are, significantly better. But remember, the comparisons are unbelievably easy. We're really going up against the service issues and labor shortages and inventory corrections and all this for a year ago. So we have a few quarters in which we have to step back when intermodal numbers come in at like plus 10%.
Yeah,
as they did last month, we need to say that's good. Obviously, that's the right direction. But what is a true number out of this? The best I can see coming out of the earnings calls that are happening in a few weeks, and really maybe for this year, is the building a base. Analysts love a base year. If here's year one, and then we could say they can grow 3%, in these commodities from year one, and we can begin to say this is where progress is being made or is not being made.
sure.
We haven't had a base year going back to 2017. I mean, we had railroads in the U.S. undergoing PSR conversion, which shed businesses in some cases, cutting intermodal back at CSX and Union Pacific. We had a trade war that was, at that time, one of the biggest things that ever happened. And then, of course, we had the biggest thing that ever happened, which was the pandemic. And the impacts of the pandemic are still being felt. We had labor shortages as a result, really, of the pandemic, and using an old playbook in a different game, et cetera. And so if we have a year in which we see, modest mid single digit volume growth against easy comparisons, at least what we've done is we said, all right, this is kind of a normal year. There are enough crews right now. Yes, they need to get more experience. but the service numbers are clearly, much better.
Yeah.
We're building a base.
Okay, that's great. That's great. And then you had just mentioned how the intermodal numbers are up. I think the last glance at the AAR's data, and I'm just talking about US only in this case, Tony. I think I saw them end up I believe it was almost through the end of March, so we don't have full Q1 data till later this week, but something like around 9-10%
Correct.
growth. I always had lately I've been doing like double takes when I look at that, but then for some of the reasons that you outlined above, it makes more sense. Um, do you think this level of intermodal growth specifically is sustainable?
Yes, because that's the great thing about having an ugly last year.
Yeah,
You can wash it away. I
yeah,
think you have a couple things going on. As we chatted before, that there's lots of worry about the consumer, but they certainly haven't abandoned purchasing. We've mostly gone through the inventory corrections, which was a pandemic impact. When everybody had stocked up because people were buying lots of things, um, and so though that impact is behind us. Service again, we can talk about that, has gotten better, so people are more willing to try intermodal. International business has recovered quite nicely, and also importantly, we should point out that there's been a share shift back to the West. I
okay.
think in talking to intermodal experts, I think they would say they're positively surprised by the international strength again against the comparisons,
Mhm.
and the domestic is doing just fine. But if international business comes into LA and Long Beach, it's very good for the entire rail ecosystem. Eastern railroads will provide service from Savannah, Charleston, New York, not Baltimore today. We'll talk about that.
Yep.
But they'd much rather pick it up at Chicago, longer haul. It's things move a lot faster if you bring them into LA, put them on a train. They're more expensive, but they're still cheaper than truck. So
Yeah.
that shift, clearly it had been a long-term shift from west to east and all water routes, and then it accelerated during the pandemic a bit, and now it's shifting back towards them. Again, using the stable, maybe my key word. Basically, that's
Sure.
good for rail. So that's helped rail intermodal numbers nicely. So I expect a good year, and as we get to real growth and we begin to lap the weak comparisons, I expect rail intermodal to come back pretty nicely. They're also coming off the trough in pricing. Their service levels will be a lot better, and I think they can finally do what they've been saying they're going to do the last 3, 4, 5 years: is go after market share. Restore share, gain share, wallet share from their customers. And another thing, I'm not sure how much it's affected the numbers yet, but it will, and it will positively. Is all these alliances and cooperative efforts, and the CPKC causing the Falcon service, and JB Hunt and BNSF and Quantum and their Mexico service, they're all about a year, coming into about a year old, and I think at some point they're really going to be starting to really be contributing to the rail intermodal story.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is really turning into a really interesting story. It got a lot of, I mean, you had just talked about quantum that got a ton of attention, especially at Rail Trends last fall.
Yeah,
Um,
it's interesting that the CPKC is a really big move towards rail to rail competition. It
mhm.
was designed to be that way because the STB has tended to think of rails, I think incorrectly, as oligopolists or even monopolists. And that's because the STB does not look at the highway, but you can't ignore the highway. And, so they really wanted to push that story. But clearly, there is a big single line competitor in the north south lanes from the Canadian US, manufacturing belt down into Texas and past Texas into Mexico. And so there's more rail to rail competition. The reaction to that has been more rail to rail cooperation, whether it's short lines and railroads working together, whether it's, adding CSX to the Meridian Speedway, CN working with NS. I mean, you've got just, all of a sudden it's seemingly everybody's phones are ringing. And that's a real positive thing. When you set the deal makers loose, and you could do that with the confidence of improving service. That's really where I thought we were going to be several years ago. It's been delayed by a variety of reasons, including the biggest sort of, biological event that hopefully we'll ever see. So,
No, absolutely. Great points. Yeah, you had just alluded to Baltimore, obviously a really tough, tragic situation, any way you look at it. From a rail perspective, Tony, carload intermodal, um, what happens in the short term, or what is happening when we think of things like diversions to other ports? Um, uh, for example, it could be Port of New York, New Jersey, Port of Philadelphia, Port of Virginia. There may be freights getting diverted to. What's sort of playing out there since the obviously last Tuesday when this horrible event happened?
Well, let's it's we have to see how long will this thing be down. I don't mean the bridge, because if you're a commuter, that's going to be a
Yeah,
problem. But
yeah.
I mean, when will the port open up? Um, from an intermodal perspective, since it's literally, you talk about three modes of transportation: an ocean-going ship, a dray, a railroad, and other options, straight over the road trucking. That will have the least impact. I already heard from the second day that Maersk and others were diverting ships. It's not a major intermodal port, but it's not in 300,000 TEU or something. But there are so many ports on the East Coast that the ship could just stop it. The
Yes.
bigger impact um, will be that Baltimore is an enormous um, imported auto site.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
don't know how that affects my world yet. When you talk to the railroads who are impacted, who go into Baltimore, CSX and Norfolk Southern, and I'll be spending a day with CSX later this week. But when you talk to them, their bigger impact is export coal. First of all, that's a very profitable business.
Hmm.
It's reasonably simple, right? You run an empty train up the hill, you fill it, and you run it down. And Baltimore is one of the only three ports. Um, some of that can be diverted, but there's not a lot of excess capacity. It's been a pretty strong product for a couple of years. What the worst case scenario from a rail perspective is that the buyers go to other sources if they can't get it on time, and that instead of being delayed, if this was a utility coal, it has to go to the utility, but they have stockpiles. So you would wait to fix the track or whatever it is, and then they would start moving again, and you simply delayed the movement. Here, with a global market, it is possible that U.S. Coal exporters could lose share during this time. I'm not predicting that. That's pretty granular for me. But then there are two other major ports, Lambert's Point and Newport News,
Okay.
and they're both bigger. But if we saw a hit to railroads, that's probably the area where it'd be, and you would see it in the volumes and also in the margins. That's very high margin business.
Okay, got it. Understood. Um, and a big topic for a little while now, Tony, has obviously been what's going on with Norfolk Southern and the activist investor Ancora looking to take various steps to influence their clout, if you will, for lack of a better word, probably not the best word, on the NS board. They want to reduce headcount. They want to remove NS CEO Alan Shaw. Um, for someone that's for those in the audience, they may not have had to have their pulse on this. Could you maybe quickly get them up to speed on this situation and what it could mean from a class one operational perspective?
So Ancora is an activist investor, and some of them, have come into the rail business before. They are 4-0-1 this century, 4 wins, and the one tie was the Children's Investment Fund at Canadian National 2 years ago,
Okay.
where they did force out the CEO, who was a growth-oriented CEO, but they didn't get their cost manager in. He later took the job, Jim Vena, at Union Pacific. So they got one part of their deal done and not the other. So that's the tie. But pretty much what these guys do is they look at you think of it as if the railroads as a herd of gazelle, and the slowest one is the one these guys want to pounce on, and do a bunch of things that would make it rejoin the herd. Actually, they want to eat it, but if they were lions. But
Yeah.
they sort of picked. Norfolk Southern has been the poorest operator since the pandemic, despite going through their own version of PSR. They've had a bunch of reasons. The primary one, for crying out loud, has been East Palestine and the incident there that could have happened to any railroad and struck them. It was on a car, first of all, in an area that was not detectable until it caught fire, a car they did not own. And that easily could have been any other class one railroads. Hopefully, with cooler heads seeming to prevail in the NTSB report coming out in the spring, we'll get some ways to try to minimize the chances of that happening again. But the point is, for Union Pacific had new management, announced a new operating strategy in December of 22, and in February of 23 last year, they had East Palestine that knocked out the main line for a significant period of time. It's cost them $1 billion roughly so far. It's hurt their reputation, at least publicly. I think the shippers and others are much more understanding, but it is also taking up all the management time, all the oxygen in the room.
Yeah.
So Ancora said, we got to get rid of Alan Shaw. Their original deck was so disjointed and poorly done, but they primarily come down to a couple of key points, which I figure that they will be finessing a little better as this goes on towards a May 9th vote by shareholders on whether their 8 board members will come in, giving them a majority of the board and effective management control if they got all 8. The things they're pushing for are tied to the operating ratio, which is, in my mind, a step backwards. That's really why I call this an existential fight here, much as the CN one was. Norfolk Southern, in that December investor meeting where they laid out their strategy, the team was new, there at that point. They basically said, we want to invest through a cycle. We want to build resiliency. We want to focus not on the operating ratio, but return on investment. We don't want to use furloughs as the first line just in order to cut costs and make the first 2 quarters of a recession look better. But then we've got to go and hire and train people, and we've lost business because of that, which all happened during the pandemic. They saw that what would go on, and so they said it's better that we have absorbed higher costs in the beginning, and we then can prove to our customers that when volume comes back, we won't be short of crews, for example. I think that philosophy, the great experiment, as I call it, is really deserves to be respected, and it hasn't been tested yet. Norfolk Southern announced this, and last year was, and we're still dealing with it. The reason those comparisons are early is that we're in a freight recession, right?
Yeah.
And so, hard when you're thinking long term, and you start off, not at water level, but a little bit below water, and then you have East Palestine. I would say that it's unfair. Now, life, isn't always fair, but it isn't fair to Alan Shaw. And people have been asking, do you have the operating chops? And so Ancora brought in Jamie Boychuk, who had been the COO at CSX, which is currently the best running railroad in the U.S. by the metrics that we see. So Alan Shaw and the board, I think very wisely, smartly, and unfortunately for the past COO, replaced the COO with John Orr. Both of those two people, the COO at Norfolk Southern and the one that Ancora is proposing to be the COO, come from the knee of Hunter Harrison. They are PSR experts. They have worked at high levels at big railroads. John was at Kansas City Southern and CPKC. So I think they kind of countered the biggest threat was like, we have this PSR operating guy. Oh yeah, you have a Canadian. Well, here's my Canadian. The other board members are not as impressive to me as and the proposed CEO comes from UPS, which we is going through some struggles of its own. He's sort of now a professional CEO in waiting. I don't know much about him. I hear he's a solid citizen, but he was proposed to be the solution for C.H. Robinson when Ancora failed in that activist raid. And so it's hard to say if you're coming from UPS and then you're going to be the answer for a brokerage company, that you're the answer for a railroad, which is a pretty particular thing. The biggest issue here is the other thing is they also said that Norfolk Southern was concentrating way too much on intermodal because intermodal does have higher OR, right? But that's not the only way to look at a company. After all, JB Hunt runs a mid to high 80s operating ratio, but they earn their cost of capital every year. So it's a silly and convoluted argument, and it's all tied down to what Alan Shaw said was a perversion of precision scheduled railroading, which is focusing just on the OR outcome. And Creel at CPKC says the operating ratio or the margin, is just the results of a process. If you're doing these things right, you should improve your margin, but you don't manage to that number. You don't incent to that number because the easiest thing to do is just cut costs rather than the hard work of growing business. And Alan Shaw and the Great Experiment have really tried to do the hard work. They're not the only ones to do this, but they were the first to come out and talk about it in this fashion. And so if they as the first ones, I think CN was doing this before. CPKC is all about growth. 80% of their benefits from the merger are growth oriented. But they have really put the great experiment in the most concise manner, and I think it's important to defend that. I think this attack is, unwarranted. And so far, they've been lucky that it's been sloppy. They're wrapping themselves in the Ohio flag and talking about, safety, which is crazy because they didn't wrap themselves in the Rhode Island flag when they attacked Hasbro and didn't win there. So if activists are 4-0-1, I would say I would put, if I were a betting person, I would bet on NC State in the Final Four because they're fun, and I would bet on Norfolk Southern management keeping their jobs. The last thing I'll say about this is there's one incredibly impressive board member in this fight, and he is currently on Norfolk Southern's board. He supports John Orr, he supports Alan Shaw, and that is Claude Mongeau, the Hall of Fame, former CN CEO. I always like to say that every railroad that Hunter Harrison went to, got better, but he was a bull in a china shop. Every railroad that he left got better again. And he was the one that took CN to the next level and made them really the company they're continuing to be today after they had, cut their costs and did that. And Claude Mongeau being on that board and supporting the current policy and supporting the personnel moves is the best vote of confidence you could have out there.
Okay, that's terrific. So just in the brief amount of time we have left, Tony, and something I forgot to mention when we were talking offline before the podcast recording, but I think you'll be equipped to answer it. It's just the whole emerging viewpoints, and the data supports it, just on cross-border logistics activity. And I'm talking mainly about between the United States and Mexico. You can't help but notice more and more US-based logistics services providers, for example, are setting up shop there. They're down in Laredo, they're down in Monterey, they're down in all the key markets. Now, obviously, this is not news really from a class one perspective, given that class ones have been moving freight in and out of Mexico for forever, really. But it's very interesting what's going on now. There's a real movement, it seems, and I'm just curious to get your perspective on it from on two fronts. One being sort of the shortening or tightening of supply chains, and I guess the other part just simply being, what does it mean for freight, rail, carload, and intermodal activity and output, in your opinion?
So it is a great market. It's the reason that KCS built up such value that they were that they ended up costing $30 billion. And it's a great opportunity. This could well be Mexico's moment. The old line about Mexico is it's the economy of the future, and it always will be, though applies. I went down to the Mexican intermodal meetings last fall, and I'll be going again this year. This sort of the Mexican IANA, if you will, called Empty. And it was in Cancun, and I like to say I went there so you all don't have to. I was willing to take that bullet for you. But it was they're all very concerned because it has been nearshoring is the phrase of the year, and that's clearly happening. And I don't know how much it's a sign of decoupling with China, because a great percentage of the foreign direct investment into Mexico is actually Chinese going around those things. But from a rail perspective, that's all fine. It's still underperforming its potential. And all of the players that were at this meeting, which included all of the major railroads, including Ferromex and CPKC and UP and BNSF and J.B. Hunt, was all those players were there, and they thought, we are growing really fast, but we really should be growing more. And a great factoid I got out of that is Mexico is roughly a quarter of Latin American GDP, but they're getting 17% of the foreign direct investment. The cross-border intermodal numbers are running double digit all the time, but they're actually, we think, talking with Larry Gross, that they're losing share there. Despite all that growth, that they should be doing better. I think these new services will help, but what's really holding it back is political instability on both sides of the border. And there's some hope. For example, the support by AMLO of Pemex means that energy in Mexico is much more expensive than it should be, and it's much dirtier than it should be. And so that doesn't help if you're going to build a new plant and you have carbon goals. In addition, it plays with and messes up a really good source of railroad revenue, which would be refined products from Texas into Mexico, which is a good source, but should be doing even better. You have, a very capricious government that shuts down, plants, breaks contracts, sent the Marines in to Ferromex to get, spending time on a passenger line in the south of Mexico, is saying that passenger lines must go on the concession railroads like CPKC, et cetera. We hope that their June elections will provide the mayor of Mexico City is the odds-on favorite, and she is viewed, I do not know her, of course, as a technocrat. And what I hope out of a technocrat, it could be left wing or right wing, but hopefully it isn't capricious and whim based, which, so that you have stability. Again, I keep coming back to that word. To invest in another country, you need rule of law, and I'm talking about contract law, and you need stability so that you could say, unlike Constellation Brands, which spent $1 billion building a beer factory and then was told, oh, you can't use the water. I mean, they need that stability. And on our side, the border issue has led to the shutting down short periods of time twice of Eagle Pass, really not because people are coming over the border on trains. They're not, because the workers, the border customs and border patrol people are needed elsewhere. They don't have enough of them. So, this election here in the U.S. will have a major role if we reinstitute a really dumb trade policy that would include tariffs on our allies as well as on our, Cold War enemies. Too strong a word, but my point.
Yeah.
In 2026, the USMCA is up for, it has to be revoted on, but reapproved. And will that become a political football? I mean, we already have very smart people like KCS's former CEO Pat Ottensmeyer working hard on that issue today. But so it's sort of this political thing that keeps this from, it's always going to be a really good market, almost no matter what, but it could be even better. And so that's the worry of Mexican business leaders, Mexican and American and Canadian transportation leaders, et cetera.
Okay, understood. That's a great point. So final question here, Tony. And if you were to sort of just lay out sort of three things that you're going to be watching closely throughout the rest of calendar year 24 as it relates to US/North America rail carload intermodal activity. It could be anything. I mean, give me volumes, the election, but three key things that people should be paying attention to over the course of the year.
Well, I'm going to leave out the election because how could you not pay attention?
Yeah.
Try to avoid that story.
Yeah, right.
But that has ramifications on that Mexican market, but on a whole lot of things, and think about it from a trade perspective. We tend to get wrapped up in, domestic non-economic issues, but there's some real economic things at stake here. But I'll leave that aside. I mean, I want to see, an inflection in volumes as the comparisons, become less easy. And see if we've really got it, underlying strength there. The most important thing, really, and the railroads are really trying to underdo more of a longer term, strategy here. So they still need to provide us things each quarter that show us that they are, moving along and making strategic gains, even if we don't see it yet in, high volume growth. And that really, that's just a long, windy way of saying I need to see consistent service improvement. Getting back to 2019 is good, but 2019 wasn't, great, right? It needs to be better. Joe Hinrichs of CSX has sort of said that, we're running the best of any U.S. railroad, but that's not good enough, right? That should restore some of the share that was lost when there were literally trains were back, there were embargoes and crew shortages, and so that's going to come slowly back because shippers had to sign contracts with truckers. So some of that natural business, but to be exciting here, the railroads need to get more share, and there's going to be more share in carload areas. There's lots of opportunity, but obviously the biggest, unlike what Ancora said, is intermodal. So I want to make sure that we see improved service metrics and that the railroads begin to show us, lay out this longer policy and say, here's how we're making progress, and go back to using the quarterly calls as what they really were intended to be, which is a snapshot taken today of the long-term plan and where they are on that journey. So, I guess obviously we're going to look at volumes, every week. I tend to step back and try to look at it monthly because weekly you can get wrapped up in, short-term things. But service is really, and service improvements, and the way these alliances and cooperative efforts and new ventures are all working, and check on the progress of those. and try to unwind and figure out how some of the acquisitions have folded in at CSX, for example. What's happening with Pan Am, the railroad they bought up in your part of the
Yeah.
woods, and
Yep.
what's happening with the Quality Carriers Chemical Trucking Company. So I'm hopeful that some of the railroads that haven't had an investor day, and I'm looking at you, CSX and Union Pacific,
Mhm.
have them. They had new managements, and so they have a good reason for not doing something last year. But those are really critical days, and they're critical for trying to shift away from just looking at the margin and the operating ratio every quarter, because they lay out the longer term vision. We see the bench strength or not, of these companies. We see what they're trying to do, and they lay out things for us to look at beyond overplaying and paying too much attention to what they report, in the third week of every, new quarter about the previous quarter.
Understood. Yeah. Well, listen,
Hopefully,
Tony.
I don't know if I gave you those three. I mean, Ancora is number one, and no, Ancora is 1 through 3, but it's Ancora, service improvements, and the success of all these kind of new offline and interline ventures, which is the success of those, I hope, will lead to just more, and I think it's very exciting. Again, you turn the deal makers loose, you turn the short lines loose to be entrepreneurial and bring what they have to the table. There should be lots of things that they can bring, and I want to see more than just the press release. I love the press releases, but I need more than that.
Yeah, no, understood. Understood. That's great. All right, listen, Tony, this brings us to the end of our allotted time for today's podcast recording. So, on behalf of Logistics Management Magazine and the Peerless Media Supply Chain Group, I'd like to just offer up a big thanks for joining us again. I think the fifth time we've had you on for a podcast. So you're definitely up there in the running, I believe, with Ian Jeffries for most times on. So
I got to be Ian. Come on.
yeah.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it very
Yeah,
much.
absolutely. And for those in the audience who want to check out Tony's website, it's simply at abhconsulting.com. And for those of you that are looking to subscribe to our podcast rather, and if you're not, just simply go look for Supply Chain 24/7 wherever you get your podcasts. It'll pop right up. And for those of you on Twitter, give us a follow simply at logisticsmgmt. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.